Hi. Great to see so many of you here. Great to see so many of you over the last couple of events. They've all been really packed, which is nice to see. A little bit of introduction from me, but I'll keep it short since I'm not the person you're coming for. An actor and writer, Paul Merton is considered to be one of Britain's greatest comedians, known for his deadpan brand of comedy and his improvisational skills. His memorable role on the BBC's Have I Got News For You has earned him 5 nominations for the British Comedy Awards, as well as the Broadcasting Press Guild Award for Best Non-Acting Performer. He is currently about to star in Aladdin at the New Wimbledon Theatre, which happens to be just 10 minutes from my primary school. So that's your fun fact for today. Paul, the floor's yours.
Hello. Thank you very much. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll turn this around a little bit so I've got my back to people.
That's all right. I'll sort
There we are. Okay.
So first of all, thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. No, it's an honour.
We were talking about Cambridge and your experiences of Cambridge over the years, and they've tended to be a little bit depleted.
Well, no, we've done we've toured, we've played Cambridge quite a few times at the Corn Exchange, but it is a sort of I think people here have had some experience of it being an exam hall. So it is a big building, and the stage is quite sort of isn't very deep, so it's actually quite a hard place to play for comedy. So the last time we said, we won't bother. So there were, but you know, you don't really get the chance to see a place when you're playing the theatre. You tend to get backstage, you tend to hang around there, you go on the stage, you get on the bus at the end and you go. So today we're just going a little sort of tour around. It's great just to be able to get a flavour, a small flavour of the place, because normally, as I say, you just come and go and you don't really see much of it.
Yeah, and I know you were at Oxford last year. And
it wasn't as good as this.
And you spoke quite a bit initially about your start in comedy, watching clowns. I was just wondering whether you could sort of discuss that a little bit, but also discuss your influences more generally. So sort of what influenced you most when you were starting off?
Well, I think, you know, particularly when you're young and you sort of like, you can develop heroes, you know, your hero worship and stuff. And, you know, when you're young and passionate about something, it really means everything to you. And I think it all started for me going to the circus when I was about 4 or 5, something like that. And Olympia at that time in Earl's Court, this was just in the early 60s, they still had circuses that had like 3,000 people in the audience. So, I mean, this massive tent, 3,000 people. And the clowns came out with their sort of baggy shoes and their ginger hair that went up at the side, and they're throwing buckets of water over each other, and the car where the wheels fall off. And everybody, you know, in the 3,000 people were just roaring with laughter at this. And I was just amazed because I'd never seen adults behave like this before. Because up to that point, adults were people who said, no, do that, eat your greens, read this, do that. But they didn't dress up. They didn't do strange, slapsticky things. So in that moment, I can say that it came to me at the age of 4 or 5 that I wanted to be part of the mechanism that created this laughter. If it had been just running on and just taking away an empty bucket from the clowns and putting on a new fresh one or something, or just doing a little bit of rolling up a carpet or something, that would have been my ideal job at that point. I would have loved it, just to be part of the thing that created all that laughter. And that's when it first really got its hooks into me. So, you know, when the Beatles came along, I didn't have an older brother or sister who bought their records, so I didn't know a lot of their music, but I was into them as people because they were funny people. So someone with a sense of humour, whether they be a pop star or a footballer, would immediately grab my attention. So then, you know, you're watching television and your grandfather points out a Charlie Chaplin film on the television and tells you he was the most famous man in the world at one point, and you wonder how this black and white silent individual could become one of the most famous people in the world. So you start reading a bit of history about it and you get into it. And then I was influenced by all kinds of people, like Spike Milligan, the Goons. You're a certain age when you get into the Goons. Hancock's Half Hour, Monty Python. I was about 12 when that first started, so I watched that all the way, from the beginning. So yeah, there was lots of things where just anything that was good, I just soaked it up.
Yeah. And what struck me when I was just looking over some of your stuff is the way those influences have continued. So you've done lots of documentary stuff on the history of comedy.
Yes.
How do you think that sort of guides what you do?
Well, I mean, I think that we have to go back to the days of Charlie Chaplin, I suppose, and Buster Keaton, people like that, who were supreme comedians, cinema comedians. And in the early days of cinema, where cinema was still trying to work out what it was, whether it was an art form or whether it was just something to entertain people that had no lasting worth. These people made films to the best of their ability and tried to make films better every year. So there was always a sort of tendency to work as hard as you could, to be as good as you could be, to present to the audience the best possible entertainment that you could. So that was an attitude that I certainly picked up on very early on, that you just always have to try and do your best. You know, it's that thing, if you're doing a long-running show or something, you know, in the West End or something, and you think on a Tuesday, you think, I don't really fancy doing it tonight. It doesn't matter whether you fancy doing it or not. You've got to go out there because audiences have come to see it and paid good money. And so you have to be at your best every time. Yeah. So it's just, in a way, learning from people who had gone in the past. I had to go to the reference books to do that, because when I started doing stand-up comedy, I was very fortunate in the 1980s, the Comedy Store had opened up in London. Now, before that, when the Comedy Store meant you could go on stage, it was a democratic thing, you could do 5 minutes. If you weren't any good, then they'd boo you off, but you could go back the following week or whatever. But before the Comedy Store opened, the ways into comedy were, by the time in the mid-70s, late 70s, you've got Cambridge Footlights. That was an avenue for people to get into it, ever since the days of Peter Cook and a few people before him. You had working men's clubs in the north, or you had sort of holiday camps, and that was essentially the only. And I wasn't bright enough to be here. I wasn't outgoing enough to be a redcoat in a holiday camp, and I wasn't northern enough to be in a northern working men's club. You know, I wasn't the kind of character that could have moved north and start doing stuff about mother-in-laws and things. It wasn't me. And
do you remember the first time you got up on stage at the comedy club?
Yes, at the Comedy Store. Yeah, it was. I'd been wanting to do it for a while, but I didn't have a piece of material that I thought was right. And then I was standing at a bus stop one evening on my way back to my mother's house to get some washing done. I was living in a bedsit at the time. And I suddenly remembered this. I was waiting for a bus at the bus stop, and I suddenly remembered this documentary that I'd seen a couple of years before. This had been in the late 70s, where a police force somewhere in Wales they'd busted this factory that was an LSD drug-making factory. And the police had heard there was illegal things happening in here. And so they busted this big warehouse without realizing there was LSD dust in the air. And that they ingested this dust. And so there was a documentary, it's called Operation Julie, and there was a documentary on television about these policemen who had suffered this, after effects. And there was a policeman sitting at a table in a pub with another policeman next to him, with a table rather like this, and he was talking to camera, and he said, I was sitting in the pub with Detective Inspector Warren when I noticed that my pint of beer was getting bigger. And that just popped into my head, and I suddenly saw the comic friction between a policeman being sort of kind of run-of-the-mill, ordinary, not particularly imaginative individual, having to describe a hallucinogenic trip. So I started writing it that night, and I spent about 6 weeks on this 4-minute routine, trying to make, because I hadn't had any experience on stage, so I thought, well, I may not be funny, but if what I'm saying is funny, then I've got a chance for it to be working, So I tried to make every single line a funny line. My favourite line in it was, he takes an hallucinogenic drug, and he was disguised as a smarty, this policeman, and he starts describing his hallucinations, and he says, 35 minutes later, I saw Constable Parish approaching me, disguised as a fortnight's holiday in Benidorm. So that gave you the sort of flavour of it, and from then on, he sort of meets Marilyn Monroe, and he flies to Planet Zanussi and stuff. But it worked really well the first night I did it at the Comedy Store. It went down extraordinarily well. The audience shouted for more. I didn't have any more, so I went and did it again. I mean, that's all I had. and I was in such a lucky position, because having wanting to be a comedian or be involved in comedy all my life, and this was about the age of 23 by that point. And it's all very well having the ambition, but until you try it, you don't know if you've got the temperament for it, you don't know if you've really got the talent for it. It might be horrific. The very idea of standing on stage trying to make people laugh might just be absolutely horrific, and you might not be able to do it. And so there's a tendency to hold back for a while, because you're not destroying your dream in case you can't do it. But it went so well on that opening night. I was very fortunate. And it got me through every sort of bad gig for the next 18 months because I started off really well and the rest of the 20 minutes was nowhere near as good. So it would always start off, oh, he's really good, and sort of like, is he? You know, as you got towards the end. But that night, I walked all the way home from Soho to Streatham, where I lived at the time, on a Sunday morning. It took about 3 or 4 hours, just on a complete high. I was just, it was just one of the most extraordinary nights of my life because you can't. It didn't happen by luck, you know. What I thought was funny turned out to be funny. It turned out to be funnier than I thought it was. They were laughing at some of the straight lines that were setting up the punchline. So it was a glorious way to start.
Amazing. And then from there, you said couple.
Oh, it took a long
years,
time.
It
took. I mean, I was around, you know, and I also sort of took a very working class attitude to it, where I looked upon it as being a 5-year apprenticeship. I didn't want to sort of get on the TV or radio straight away. The old acts that I talked about, like Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton, or maybe the Marx Brothers or Morecambe and Wise, all these people spent a long time serving an apprenticeship, doing your bad gigs in front of 20 people, making your mistakes when there's nobody watching you, you know. So that when the time comes, if you get the opportunity, if you're lucky enough for the opportunity to come along, you've got more of a sense that you know what you're doing. So you've got hopefully more chance of staying where you want to be, rather than just, you know, fading away an overnight success sort of thing and then disappearing again.
Yeah, and I suppose before we get on to television, radio, and all of those successes, about that sort of 5-year apprenticeship, the sort of techniques and skills you picked up, those are still skills and techniques?
Yes, you know, there's a way of walking
today.
on stage. There's an energy you must have. You know, there's a certain, you know, I do a lot of improvisation these days because I'm too lazy to write anything. And essentially, improvisation is about listening to people on stage, listening to what other people have said. So if I'm not listening to you and you're not listening to me, nothing happens. The scene doesn't work. So there's a discipline and there's a technique that allied with instinct and experience, you know.
And what I was thinking about in terms of improvisation.
Yes.
When you have a moment where you just have no idea what to do, do you have those? What's your first step? Where you just
look at the person you're on stage with and make it look like it's their fault. Is a good technique. But you're on stage with somebody else, so you know you're never stuck on your own. You're never sort of there for the minute thinking, "Oh, right, what do I?" You know, somebody will say something, and then you bounce off that. It's some people can write comedy on their own, and they're very skilled people, because most comedy writers, teams of writers, are 2 people or more, because you're bouncing off somebody else. So that's what in the improvisation thing, there's never a thing where you're there alone, because if you look as if you're floundering, you're stuck, somebody will come on and say, Admiral, the submarine's ready for inspection, or whatever it is, you know. And so off you go. So, you know, you don't... and also the trick is not to look as if you don't know what's happening.
Okay. Yeah, I'll try not to do that now. But, so after that, you've spent your 5 years doing your apprenticeship in developing your skills, learning your trade. And then on to, I think, first Channel 4?
Channel 4, yes.
Radio as well.
Yeah, Channel 4 was the first thing. There was, I appeared in a show called Comedy Wavelength, which was a series of sketches written by the general public with no previous writing experience, and I was doing the sort of comparing in between the sketches. And again, it was something I'd learnt from my reading, because you know, at the age of 12, I was reading every book I could read about comedy or its practitioners. And quite often, you get an early success in show business, in television, by being good in something that's not very good itself. So this show wasn't very good because the sketches were written by members of the public, and there was no script editor that was advising them, or they were just sort of like, yeah, that's too short, that's too long, and let's do this. So they weren't great sketches. They hadn't been honed. They hadn't been rehearsed properly. So I could come on and do 2 or 3 lines, you know, in between, and get this huge response and then disappear again. So I looked very good in something that wasn't a great show. But that's quite often how you get your first start, you know.
Yeah. And then from there, moving into obviously Room 101, which of course is a format lots of us here will be familiar with. What sort of attracted you to that?
Well, I think with the way that I used to do it, with just having one person that you're interviewing, is you get to sort of, you know, it's like the reverse of Desert Island Discs. Instead of saying, I want to be able to listen to Mozart's Horn Concerto forever, it's somebody saying, I can't stand Shirley Bassey. I can't stand the sound. It was Michael Grade, who's a very big, you know, TV exec, said, I like her very much as a person, but I can't stand her voice. And so we played him a bit of Shirley Bassey, and he was actually sort of in pain. His face was grimacing. We had to stop it. So you're finding something else. You're finding something about him. You're finding about people's vulnerabilities and about their character. And to spend half an hour with somebody with their choices is quite revealing. So I always enjoyed that. And I always took the opportunity as well to make sure that the subject, the person that I was interviewing, was the subject of the show. So it was a platform for them. Not me sort of like, okay, you're going to do this and I've got a whole load of gags here. It would be... There was one I did with Johnny Vegas. Now, I'd like to always know, the answer to a question in an interview because you want to know whether it's going to take you into an interesting area. And at one point, Johnny Vegas was talking about, this was 20-odd years ago, he was talking about his addiction to online gaming and stuff and creating parallel universes. And he was told me he was running a pub on the internet. And so that it meant that he had to order beer in. He had to order beer in. He had to sort of like organise bands. I don't know what he was doing. But he said, I said to him one time during this interview, I said, how long have you spent in one go, just in front of a computer screen, just doing this? He said, I don't know, I think it was about 24 hours. And I had no idea that he was going to say 24 hours, and it was stunning. And in the 10, 15 minutes of him talking about it, I didn't have to interrupt him. I didn't have to feel like, I've got a joke here, whatever. It was just occasionally you steered him because he was being so engrossing about this, his commitment and his addiction to this fantasy pub that it was hypnotic listening to him. And again, that's a thing from being, I think a good interviewer is somebody that doesn't try to impose themselves on, it's like what you're doing. They don't try to... No, but it's true, though. You're listening, you know what I'm saying? And so your next question is based on what I've just said. So that was...
Sorry.
No. I didn't mean it to sound like that, but I'll accept it.
And
you've got a lot of wedding photos up here, haven't you?
Yeah. That wasn't on my list.
No.
In terms of Room 101.
Yes.
So you, of course, did Room 101 yourself.
Yes.
Can you remember what you put into it?
Oh, yeah, I did it on the radio. Obscure things. There's a film called Genevieve. I don't suppose anybody here would know it now, but made in the 1950s. Actor called Kenneth Moore has got the most annoying laugh in it. Ha 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 ha! Throughout the film, he laughs like that. So I had Kenneth Moore's laugh put in. I can't remember what the rest of them were, sadly. If I'd thought about it, I could have said, but I don't know. I can't remember. It was a long time ago I did it.
Yeah.
But it's a very good format, though,
Yeah. Maybe that's an alternative we can use at some point. I don't know. Ideas. But after that, I'm going to move on to Have I Got News for You?
Yes.
Which obviously is an absolutely iconic TV show.
Yes.
I'm a massive fan. I've been a massive fan for a long time. Just how do you get involved with that? Did you just hear it when it was being pitched?
It was one of those. John Lloyd, who is the producer of Spitting Image and Not the 9 O'Clock News, and now does a show on Radio 4, the Museum of Curiosity. He was going to host this news quiz called John Lloyd's News Round, was the working title for it. And we did a pilot for it. Myself and Ian were the two team captains. Ian Hislop, I don't know if you've heard of him at all. He was the other team captain, and we recorded the pilot on a very hot summer's day in a room about a tenth the size of this one. It was beautiful weather. Nobody really wanted to be there. It didn't really work as a programme, but the BBC had already committed to it because John Lloyd was going to do it, and John Lloyd had a very high reputation and still has at the BBC. And then he decided he didn't want to do it. But they'd already commissioned it, so the whole pilot procedure was completely, subverted really. Because on the basis of the pilot, you wouldn't have commissioned it, but because he was doing it, he said yes, they will have it, and then he said he didn't want to do it. So they were stuck with a program that they didn't know what it was going to be. But it quickly sort of gelled. We quickly realised, the differences between me and Ian are quite big, but also we have a lot of similarities as well. Ian's got a very bright, astute, quick comic brain. And he's a great journalist as well, and he takes himself incredibly seriously. So that's enormous fun for me to. And why do you think you normally win? What's it which gives you an edge? Ian doesn't read any tabloids, so if it's not in the Daily Telegraph or etched on a stained glass window, he doesn't really know anything about it, Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair answer. I think it's on those missing words things, you know. Well, I have quite inspired guesses because you know, it's last week. What was it last week? I don't know. It'll be canoeing or something, and you see the typeface. Looks, oh, that doesn't look like a normal typeface. This is probably Canoe Weekly, so you say canoe or whatever it is, you know. And so I accrue more points at the end, really.
Yeah. So it's
Which shows you the value of a university education, doesn't it? Because
well, he did go to Oxford.
he did go to Oxford. Yeah, I went there. They'd never heard of him.
And in terms of have I got news for you, do you have any sort of moments which really stick out, or favourite guests, favourite hosts?
Spike Milligan, Peter Cook, on the very early days in the 1990s were on it, and that was going back to what I was saying right at the top. When you have a comic hero or a hero in any profession, any field, whatever it is, when you're young, you really fall for them in a big way. So that then find yourself sitting next to them or working on a program with them is truly surreal. To really use that phrase, that word, you just can't believe it. I did a series for ITV about 20 years ago based on some old Tony Hancock scripts with two writers called Ray Gorton and Alan Simpson, who wrote Steptoe and Son. And I idolised them when I was growing up. And then suddenly here I am for 2 months in a rehearsal room once a week, just going through their material, doing stuff, you know, and talking to them and then having lunch with them. And you can't... It's incredible. You can't really believe that it's happening, that you are sharing, that they're the same as you and you're the same as them, and they're saying hello and you're saying hello back. They've stepped out of a book, and they're still giants to you. I mean, Alexei Sayle is somebody who is I'm still in awe of Alexei Sayle because I saw him doing stand-up in 1980 before I started, and he was just sensational. And so whenever I meet him, which is infrequently, I can't be anything but a fan. And I don't want to talk to him too much because I'll just embarrass him. Or embarrass myself or something, but it's difficult when you see somebody in heroic status that then sort of talk to them as individuals. I suppose you get to know them after a while, but the early days of Have I Got News for You were it started very quietly because it's the show that's recorded the night before it goes out. Nobody's reviewing it in the papers because they haven't got copies to review or preview. And so gradually it just sort of, you know, it took flight over a couple of years and then really sort of got going.
Yeah. I know I may have this wrong, but you have hosted it.
Yes,
once.
I did once, yes.
How was that?
Fairly straightforward. I mean, I'd been sitting there watching somebody else do it for 12 years.
Yeah.
And I can't remember his name now, but it was... Yeah, it was fairly straightforward. You're reading the auto cue. You know, you've got material written for you.
Yeah.
You look straight ahead, and you do the jokes. And so that's not although the hours are longer, that's probably not the harder job. The harder job is what myself and Ian are doing, and the others in that we are genuinely ad-libbing, improvising at the time. You know, so it's a different role, but it's in some ways it's more of a safety net, the person in the middle. Yeah. And you always get. In a recording, they always get the opportunity to redo something at the end, you know. So there's always retakes of the person in the middle, which just makes it look neater, you know.
Yeah, and before I go to questions from the audience, I'm sure you've got loads and you've heard enough of me, but I was just wanted to see whether you could reflect a little bit on that change, that sense of change over time. So you're obviously now encountering your heroes. You've had that shift in your career, but the political world has obviously taken a shift, and especially over the last 2 years, we're moving into a different world in that regard. How do you find that? Do you think satire is adapting, normalizing this new political landscape?
Well, I mean, it's in the 28 years that the show has been running, it's the first time, the last 2 years, is where you've had 2 stories that won't go away. Because normally the news, you know, 24-hour cycles, a story comes and it goes. But obviously with Trump and Brexit, these are stories that are still with us very much every day, every week. There's some sort of new development or obstacle. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know. Satire doesn't, you know, I think it's Peter Cook that said that, you know, the Weimar Republic had all these cabarets in Berlin, but it didn't stop Hitler coming to power. And it's sort of, there is... Ian's the one you should speak to about the power of satire, really, because he's got more more thought out, more reasoned thinking about it, probably. But I'm really, when I was doing stand-up, I was never really doing political stuff. I didn't, so I'm not really the ideal choice for Have I Got News For You. That's why I get the sort of funny animal story or something, the monkey that can play the harpsichord. Yeah, so that's my sort of more light relief, which sometimes is what the program needs.
Yeah. And from there, what's the future now? Where are you looking to?
Well, there's a train that leaves at about 9:14. I'm reliably informed.
Yeah, quite sure.
I'm doing a pantomime at Wimbledon this year. I'm playing Widow Twankey.
Okay.
Which is going to be an experience, but that'll be fun. Because again, pantomime is like one of those things going to the circus when I was young. It's a very magical experience, and they have this 3D effect with the Abanaza, and the ring disappears and spiders come flying out towards the audience in 3D. So that's going to be fun. And Have I Got News For You runs in just a minute, which is my favourite job of all. That's still running. I've been doing that since 1988. Nicholas Parsons, who's hosting that, is 95 this year. Incredibly, he's the only man currently working in show business who's mentioned in the Bible. Old Testament as well, actually. He's one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. He's the one with the blazer and the cravat. The god of lounge suits, I'm not sure. So those 3 things continue. On stage, the Comedy Store Players, Impro Chums on stage when we tour, TV, Have I Got News For You, radio, just a minute. So I'm constantly working in any one of those 3 disciplines, and so it's great. It's in a very insecure profession. It is extraordinary, really, that I've ended up being as secure as I am, or have been anyway.
And on that note, thank you for answering my questions.
No worries.
What we'll do is we'll go out to, I'll look at this side, which I haven't seen you for a while. But if anyone has a question, can you put your hand up and wait for a microphone to come round to you? So hands up.
There's a hand up right in the back.
There was right next to the...
Hello. I have a technical question that
Yes.
I was hoping you might be able to help me with. How does the scoring on Have I Got News For You?
There is a person, I believe it's a man, there is a person who's responsible for the scoring. One of the producers, Richard Wilson, is the producer, not the actor, the producer. He doesn't know who this person is either or where they are. And he doesn't want to find out. So there are certain key elements of the production who have no idea who is doing the scoring or how they come about it. Sometimes it won't make sense because they've lost a round in the edit. So there might be a odd one out round, which for some reason didn't work as well, or there's something better coming up. So they lose it. So suddenly my score goes from 10 to 14 or something. But no, it doesn't. Trying to work out the scoring is no. You'll never get there. It's a labyrinth of madness wrapped inside an enigma, inside a riddle, and whatever that is.
Perfect. Anyone else?
There we are. Another gentleman there.
How much do you feel that your experience on Have I Got News For You has changed your outlook on politics and the world around you? Not just strictly.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it has changed much of my outlook. I mean, 'cause I'm not actually, when I'm relaxing, I'm watching, Charlie Chaplin films or something like that, or ancient movies on DVD. I'm not, the politics of stuff, I'm not really a political animal in terms of following party politics much. So, particularly in recent years, recent times as well with the Brexit thing, I mean, if something happens, I'll hear about it. But I'm not sort of slavishly watching the 6 o'clock news every time. So no, I don't think it's changed me that much, actually. I know, well, there is something, and I don't know if I can say this, how this will sound. But I mean, Ian is a very, very middle-class guy, public school boy. And he has very good manners. He has great social manners. He's very good with all sorts of people. And I think I've learned in some ways from him and from people like Nicholas Parsons as well, who's sort of middle-class, solid middle-class upbringing, people who know how to behave well. I'm not saying that I was always urinating in the streets or something, but and it took me 5 years to use the word urinating. I think I've sort of kind of become more rounded, perhaps, just from meeting other people. Maybe one thing about politicians, I suppose, maybe one way to answer your question is that they are almost always disappointing when you meet them. They're very strange people. They do have an extra gene or an extra layer of skin or something where they really don't care what people say about them because they're very determined that what they're saying is right. And what passes for wit and humour in the House of Commons is pretty thin stuff when you put it into the scrutiny of daylight. So some of them are quite weird.
Any other questions? I'll just go down here.
Do you ever feel sorry for the politicians and public figures that you satirize?
No. No, I don't think so. I think that would be misguided sympathy. No, I don't think so. Generally speaking, the politicians are pretty, as I say, they're pretty thick-skinned, so they're not going to be bothered about. In fact, you have to watch out because they'll use the vehicle of humour to add to their appeal, because people like people who are funny, who make them laugh, generally speaking. And so, not mention anybody in particular, Boris Johnson, for example, has done it very well, hasn't he? And sort of his appearances on Have I Got News for You, he was initially, the first time he was on, he really hated it because Ian tried to pin him down on a notorious phone call between Boris and Darius Guppy, where Boris seemed to be agreeing to have a journalist beaten up. And Ian questioned him on this, and Boris wasn't very happy. But then people started telling Boris how well he'd come across on the show. And so the next time he came on, he was sort of, he was sort of very happy. If they can use the programme to sort of aid their appeal and popularity, they will. The best example I can think of, and this is going back a long way now, is Cecil Parkinson, who was in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet. He came on in 1992-93, and at that point he'd had a child with his secretary, his mistress, secretary, who he had taken out an injunction. I think we weren't allowed to know about the existence of this child at one point. I think that was the case. And Ian started to sort of try and cross-examine him from across the studio floor. But Cecil, with his parted hair and his nice jacket and his lovely manners and his way of talking, just charmed everybody. And Ian couldn't really lay a glove on him, He sort of said a couple of things and just, I think you'll find that's all made up and all this sort of stuff. And everybody afterwards saying, wasn't he good, Cecil Parkinson? So I think that was very early on within the Tory party. They realised that there's an advantage to being seen to be, you can laugh at yourself. So there is something that, I don't know what you can do about that, but that's why they come on. I imagine. I can't think there's another reason. Unless it's to meet me.
Perfect. And actually, initially, I was going to the person in front of you. So,
I'm really hoping there's at least one other person in this room that understands why I'm asking this question. But hearing you talk about Room 101 and Kenneth Moore, is that the name?
Kenneth Moore, yes.
Have you heard Elaine Page's laugh?
Yes.
I just needed to know if it was in your life and how you felt, if that was more or less.
I have undertaken therapy at a special clinic in Switzerland, which I don't know why I went that far. Yes, well, she's the sort of person you wouldn't want to tell her that she had a strange laugh. She wouldn't be pleased to be told that, I don't suppose.
Well, do you think her crying's even worse then?
Yeah, well, do you listen to a Radio 2 show? Is that where you've heard her laugh?
No, I've just, for some reason on my YouTube history, just often, Elaine Page's laugh. It's just up there without even listening to the radio show.
Well, I don't know much about computers, but I'd turn it off if I were you.
I feel like this is more of a confession than a question. Thank you.
Love it.
She is the female Kenneth Moore. Or he's the male Elaine Page.
Any more questions, confessions? We'll go to the very back there. And I'll also look at the gallery in a bit. So,
you wouldn't mention the name of the former host for Have I Got News for You. I just wondered if the friction between the two of you think, helped with the sort of a popularity of the show, or if you'd comment on that.
Yes, well, Angus did it for about 12 years, I think it was, something like that. And he was very much... the dynamic of it is that the person in the middle is the figure of authority. So you can always jest or take the piss out of the figure of authority, because that's funny, because but the figure of authority, the person hosting it has to be a certain, they have to be able to do their job. Like sometimes when we've had people come in and read the autocue in the middle who aren't very good at it, you can't really have a go at them because it'd be bullying. So somebody has to be fairly robust for you to be able to go, well, you're just useless, aren't you? Just reading stuff out loud, you can't even do that properly. Now, if you said that to somebody who couldn't do it properly, that wouldn't be great. But if somebody can do it, then it's funny. You're basically, it's pricking pomposity, not to say that he had any. But he made a popping noise every so often.
Any questions? I'm going to go right up there.
Yep.
With something like Spitting Image, there hasn't really been enough characters in British politics until kind of now and politics worldwide. Do you think that kind of show could make a comeback given
Well,
who
I mean, Spitting Image is an interesting case in point because when it started, it was quite savage about the politicians. You had, I think Norman Tebbit, if I remember, was portrayed as kind of a zombie, essentially. But the politicians would phone up the producers of Spitting Image and say, "Oh, I'd love that puppet. Can I buy the puppet of me?" And so they kind of embraced it in a way that was they liked the publicity. I mean, they do say about Spitting Image that one thing it did hit the what were they called? I suppose the STP Liberal Alliance when David Steele was always appearing. Sorry, that's me, is it? David Steele was always appearing in the top pocket of David Owen, and that's apparently in the minds of the British electorate sort of. Created the dynamic between the two of them, as it were. But I mean, Margaret Thatcher was shown, as a pretty sort of strong light. But then, as somebody said, people like strong leaders. So it didn't do her any harm at all. So, I mean, in terms of mounting that production now, I mean, it just cost a fortune to do it. And I think in the end, it shows that, it's very difficult for satire to have a real impact, I think.
Questions. I'm going to go to the hand there. So, yeah. Thank you.
I was wondering how you prepare usually for Have I Got News For You? Like, are you reading the news thinking, oh, I hope this topic comes up, I've got loads of funny things I could say, or do you get to the night before and you think, oh, I have no idea what happened this week?
No, I'll give you an example, actually. The other day we were travelling on the train and somebody had left a copy of the Sun newspaper on the train and I hadn't bought a copy of the Sun for, I don't know when, a long, long time, decades. And I was flicking through it, in the 10 minutes it takes to read it, and I suddenly saw this story that was only like 5 lines long. And I turned to my wife, Suki, and I said, I think this is the most non-news story I've ever read in my life. And as soon as I saw it, I knew it would come up on Have I Got News For You. And the story simply was, Liam Neeson says he's working with a horse on a film, and the horse remembers him from a previous film. And that was the story. It was about that big. And it was headlined, "It's Liam Neeson," or Nason, I think it was, Liam Neeson says a horse remembers him from a previous film, and that was it. So, yeah, that came up. But I tend to watch the TV news because they will, whatever news story they have at the beginning will be taken from news footage, and it'll be, the biggest stories of the day. So, no, I don't tend to, I don't prepare anything. It's really, apart from something like the Liam Neeson thing, when you think that's got to come up as a thing, and it did. But otherwise, no, I don't know what's going to happen. And if you look at it, I'm really sort of winging it, and I'm just reacting to what people are saying around me, or somebody asks me a question, or a person next to me has said something. So you can see it's not really prepared, because otherwise we'd all be rehearsing for a week, and that wouldn't be pretty.
We go down here.
Hi, you mentioned that Just a Minute was your favourite show to be on. I was just wondering, firstly, what's it like working with Giles Brandreth? But then second of all, I was wondering if we could have 60 seconds on the topic of the Cambridge Union.
Well, there's no harm in me saying no, is there? I don't know enough about the Cambridge Union to do it, really. Giles Brandreth, No, he's a nice enough guy. You know, he's a nice enough guy. He's one of the nicest official biographers of Prince Philip that I've ever met. He's in the top 10. That's definitely. No, he's very, well, you know, the thing about Just a Minute is it's a competitive game, but in a real sense as well, we're all really making the program together. So there's no, if it's over-competitive, if you care too much about it, then it can sometimes ruin the balance of it. But, I mean, I will throw away the subject if I think of a joke, and I will just say something that's, you know, so say I get this, okay, Paul, your subject is the Cambridge Union, your time starts now. I don't know anything about the Cambridge Union. And somebody buzzes, and that's it. So I've got to laugh out of something 3 seconds long. So Giles would never do that. He would probably know enough about the Cambridge Union to be able to talk about it for a long time. But he's, professionally speaking, he's a joy. It's only when, no. Stop yourself.
Any more questions? Yeah.
I've been to like a couple of TV recordings. I know that lots of stuff gets cut by the time you've got like, they sat there for 5 hours, for half an hour's actual TV at the end. What is kind of your favourite thing which you filmed, which actually in the end didn't make it into the TV show itself?
Well, I mean, some of these panel shows will record about 3 hours in an evening. We tend to try and do about an hour and a half, an hour and 40, which still is a long time. But I think you get to a certain point where if you haven't got the half-hour show within an hour and a half, it's not, you know, you keep chasing it. It's not going to get any better. The audience start getting tired. You get tired yourself. The seats that the audience are sitting on aren't particularly comfortable. So, you know, there's a number of reasons why. But maybe I can answer it this way, because I think if anything really works, it does get in. You know, I mean, occasionally or quite often there's lines I've said which they cut, but I know why they've cut them. Sometimes I say something funny between two boring bits. And you can only keep the funny bit if you keep the two boring bits. So that is a reason why it goes. But here's something that I fought to get into the show, and eventually they did accept it. I said, about 2 series in, I said, wouldn't it be a funny idea if Angus asks me a question, and I sort of look at him, and then I sort of just look up to the sky as if I'm dreaming, and the camera goes into one of those wobbles, and you go through to an effect where me and Ian are running through the countryside, hand in slow motion. And every time I mention this to a new producer, said, no, that's no good. People won't understand it. They won't think it's funny. Well, what do you mean they won't understand it? It's quite simple to understand. So after about 5 years, some new producers came in, and I sort of rather wearily sort of said, look, I'm just going to say this as I say it every time. And he said, oh, that's a good idea. So we went and filmed it, and it worked really well. But that was, you know, sometimes people can underestimate an audience's intelligence. It's not going to confuse anybody. They can see it's a dream because I've looked up or a vision, or you know, the singing of my soul, and then I come back and say, I'm sorry, I was miles away, and that's it. It worked perfectly well, but it took a lot of convincing to do it, and I never understood what was the problem anyway. Because if it doesn't work, you could always cut it out. But I suppose I didn't want to set a precedent where I don't know, I was doing their job or something, but. So yeah, I think nothing's really been cut out that worked. They always find a way of getting it in.
Perfect. I think, was there a hand up there? Was I hallucinating? Yes, up there. This is going to be a bit of a sprint. Is the microphone? Yeah. Thanks, Liam.
Is the left funnier?
Than what? Than the right?
I mean, you can include centrist as well, but I would have thought they were a bit of a non-entity, so...
I didn't hear that last bit, was that?
Apparently centrists are a bit of a non-entity.
Centrists are a bit of a non-entity. Well, that's a position which is obviously one that you'll come to lose over the years. I don't know. I mean, it's sort of, there is no... there's humours everywhere. It's not the... you can take the piss out of anybody, essentially, and should be able to. Yeah, I don't know. I think, you know, the left has its idiocies as well as the right. You know, there's madness and strangeness everywhere you go, really.
Perfect. I'm going to go the very back there. Yeah.
is it easier, essentially, to take the piss out of a government that's in power or the opposition, and why?
Well, the government are trying to do things, aren't they? So essentially, whether the government of the day, I mean, when it was Blair and Blair or Brown after him, there was lots of anti-Labour stuff on, well, not anti-Labour, I suppose anti-Labour if you want, on Have I Got News For You. But then it's, the people who are in power at the moment, it's easier when you're in opposition because you don't have responsibility for anything. So generally speaking, but they do try to balance it up. So, I mean, because there will be people who will complain, who will have a stopwatch and say, well, you did 4 jokes about Jeremy Corbyn and 5 jokes about Theresa May or whatever it would be. So I think there is a sort of, which I'm not really part of, but I think there is a sort of balancing act that goes on because both sides will complain vociferously if they feel that they're being undertaken the piss out of. That's a good sentence for you, isn't it? So yeah, I think probably easier to, because it's easier to take the piss out of power, I suppose.
Perfect. So, the question after this one, up in the gallery, so we can get the microphone round. But before that, very close to me down here.
Hi, Paul.
Hi.
I love the give and take between you and Ian on Have I Got News For You, and I love the give and take that you have with Nicholas, and well done on 50 years of
Yes, I haven't been there the whole time, but it's extraordinary.
And I know he's been on since the 1960s or so, but wanting to be on it since the Jurassic period. But I heard that you wanted to be on it since you were very young, and I was wondering, what was the first time like, and do you enjoy it as much as you seem to?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So the last part of your question first. No, absolutely, it's enormous fun. And Nicholas has, he's great. He has a huge sense of humour about himself, which is, the things I say about him only work because he takes them in really good part. When he says there's a light in front of me and I don't know what it is, and I say, well, that's the one that's keeping you alive. If he'd reacted in a bad way, that wouldn't be funny. But he always laughs heartily. Now, what were you saying before that? When I first heard the programme, it started in 1967, so I was about 10, 11, something like that. I wrote to the only time I ever wrote to somebody to say, could I be on your show, I wrote to the producer. Kenneth Williams had died a few months beforehand. I'd met Nicholas at some TV show, and he said, oh, you'd be good on the show. And so I wrote to the producer who, in 1988, was rather worried about having me on the show. This was when comedians like myself were called alternative comedians. It was a sort of label that lasted for a few years. And this producer, who was very old school BBC, Ted Taylor, really didn't know who I was, but was booking me because Nicholas had recommended me. And he wanted to have a phone call with me, first of all, to see what I'd be wearing. What language, to tell me about the language that we don't use on Radio 4, I quickly got the impression that he thought he was booking Sid Vicious. But because I knew the show well, when I came in to do it, and I was very respectful to the older players of the show at that time, so I was able to fit in quite nicely, and it took a while to get established, but it is my favourite job. It's just great. The brilliance of the programme is the simplicity of the game. And yet very complicated if you want to make it complicated. But, that's why sort of younger kids like it, like 10-year-olds like it, because they can understand. It's very easy. You can't repeat, you can't deviate, you can't hesitate. It's as simple as that. In the same way that golf is simple to understand, but not so easy to play. And it's just a joy. And I'm doing another series of them shortly with Nicholas. And it's, again, you see, here is somebody that I remember seeing on television when I was 6 years old. And here I am working with him. He was born in 1923. It's just extraordinary, and yet he's still completely alert and with it, and it shows that the brain, like any other muscle, if you use it, it keeps young, keeps fresh. Yeah.
Perfect. I'm going to go up to there.
Hi. Could you talk a little bit about the sort of transition between spending these 6 months on sort of 4 minutes of material to where you are now today, sort of doing multiple hours of material a week, sort of week in, week out?
I always found it really hard to write material for myself when I was being a stand-up. In the sort of 10 years that I did it, I don't think I ever really had more than about 18 minutes of material. I was on the Comedy Store one night, and I was standing backstage and I suddenly saw this red light appear on stage in front of the comedian, but placed in such a way that the audience can't see it. And I said, "What's that?" And they said, "Oh, that's the light we flash when the comedian's done too much and we want him off." I'd never seen that light in my life. I never quite had 20 minutes. I had a very good 17 and a half. But writing on my own, I found really difficult. Writing with other people, much easier. When you're improvising, as I was saying earlier, you're with it just a minute. Nicholas says something, Giles Brandreth says something, I say something. So it's all a mix. It's all just reacting to what people are saying. But on my own, I found it incredibly hard to... and even when I did write a good joke, I didn't know it was a good joke. I had a joke that was... that for a while became the opening part of my act once I dropped the policeman on acid thing. And it was, this was the joke. During the Blitz in the Second World War, my dad used to say, "Don't worry about the bombs. The only bomb you've got to worry about is the one that's got your name written on it." That scared the next door neighbours, Mr. and Mrs. Doodlebug. Now, I had that in a book for about 2 years before I even tried it out. And somebody said, "That's a really good joke." I said, "Is it?" And I didn't know. So it was really hard being a solo stand-up writing material. I just found it really difficult. But with the impro, it just flows. So I think that's the reason why I stopped doing stand-up, really. And also the more social aspect of being on stage with 4 or 5 other people is great. Because you can go to the bar afterwards, you have a chat, you've been in the show, you've done the show together. You haven't got that sort of rather cliched vision of the comedian that sits in the dressing room on his own, And I did that once when I was touring as a solo stand-up 20-odd years ago. And then I was sitting in the dressing room at half-time, in the interval, having a cup of tea, listening to the buzz of the crowd, just sitting there on your own. And you sort of think, well, I don't want to be this lonely, tragic figure, So it's something that I fell out of love with, really. But so impro, in the short answer, is much easier.
Perfect. I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Okay.
2 more. So I'll pick one and then you can pick the last one.
Sure.
So I'm going to go to the very back there.
You say that this journey was sort of based on idolizing figures in comedy at the time, and then you began to meet them. Did anybody who you had previously idolized really let you down? And do you think that maybe that could have set you back or put you off comedy?
I don't think so. I've been very lucky. I know exactly what you say. I met Spike Milligan on a couple of occasions, and Spike, he was bipolar. He was blown up in the war. He had shell shock. So I mean, he could be really short-tempered and could be very sort of dismissive of anybody that was doing stuff now. But he told Harry Hill to fuck off. But he didn't say that to me. He was in a better mood, I think, that day. But no, he would have... even if he'd been rude to me or been dismissive of me, I still would have known that was the way he was. But the fact that he said something very kind and very, complimentary, which was, again, one of those astonishing moments where I wasn't expecting him to say anything, and he could have easily have just been, rude. And it wouldn't have mattered because I would have known that that's part of what part of his life and part of what he was living with. But no, I never met anybody that was a hero that let me down. No, I was very lucky. Peter Cook was an absolute delight on the 2 or 3 times I met him. He invited me to his house once, and I'm there, and then Eric Idle from Monty Python walks in, and you just can't believe that you're in this situation. You're just sitting there very shyly drinking a can of Coke, and Eric Idle starts talking about how much he likes your show. And it is, again, to use that word properly, surreal. It is very strange where the people that you watched on the television when you were a very young, impressionable age are talking to you, and they know who you are, and they know your work. So it is, it's bizarre. That is very bizarre. But no, nobody has ever been nasty. Been lucky, I suppose.
Perfect. And for the final question, who do you want?
That man there with the beard and the glasses. He's got his hand up.
Hi, Paul.
Hi.
Who would be your dream guest to have on Have I Got News For You, who haven't been on it already?
Somebody who was asked many times, and it's unfortunately it won't happen now, Victoria Wood, I think. I was such a huge fan of her work. I don't think there's been really anybody to touch her in the last 30 or 40 years. Her stand-up, her sketches, her plays, her songs, just her creativity. I think she was quite a shy person. Again, somebody I met once or twice, but I think she was quite shy, and I don't think that was the sort of thing she wanted to do, but she would have been right at the top. And when I was doing Room 101 as well, we desperately wanted to have her, but it wasn't something that she wanted to do. She was quite private, I think. But I would say she would be the one that it would have been great to have her on. But for reasons of her own, she never wanted to do it, which was, a shame, but there we are. She knew what she was doing, no doubt.
Well, sadly, I think that
They're looking for a new Speaker of the House, by the way, because you're sitting in the right position here. You've got the command of the room. You've gone from one side to the other. I'd put an application in if I were you.
Yeah, I'll talk to the careers office.
Yeah, do. Yeah, talk to the careers office.
Yeah, probably more useful than what I'm doing at the moment. But yeah, well, on that note, thank you so much for coming and taking the time up on a Monday evening, especially when you've got so much on. So can everyone give a massive round of applause to Paul?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I've got a few announcements. Perfect. We'll have one more thank you when we head out, but just a few announcements from me. So thank you to all the stewards, all the AV people. A reminder that you can, all of you, help us out by stewarding. It's a great deal. £5 bar tab, you get the best seats in the house. You also get a free panino, so what's not to like. In terms of the events we have coming up, so on Wednesday we have Josh Littlejohn, who's a really exciting social entrepreneur who set up a really exciting charity in Scotland. We've got our debating workshops tomorrow, and then we've got the Churchill debate on Thursday. This house believes Churchill was no hero, which I think should be really interesting. That's all from me. So as we head out, can we all just give a massive final round of applause to Paul Merton?